failure, I think, in the industry, enterprise adoption. We are still buying cloud like we used to buy hardware and software, right? We're locking in for multi-year contracts. And as a result, you don't focus on the elasticity. Let me explain this as well, because elasticity is different from scalability. COVID proved, for the most part, the big hyperscalers could survive, withstand such a massive increase in demand. Elasticity is your ability to dial up as far as you need to, but probably more so to dial down to zero. Right, so these cloud-native platforms are examples of how you do that. Elasticity, I listened to a presentation last week from an Australian organisation. Come and ask me if you want to know who they are. It was public. Oh, look, it was public, so why not? Macquarie Bank, they had an example of where moving from EC2 to EKS, from IaaS to containers to more cloud-native, cut their costs by 50%. Cut their cost by 50%. I mean, that's a huge potential and a great example of that elasticity that you can get if you go cloud native. Now, of course, that's all well and good for new workloads, application modernization. Technical debt is something that you suffer with. Interestingly, we are starting to see a retreat from lift and shift as well, because lift and shift is not going to cut it. You've got to at least lift and optimize. All right, so starting from a small base, but being the majority of your new work, you'll take advantage of these newer cloud innovations. So, we'll get to AI. I've got to say AI. It's contracted for all analysts to say AI today. These more native service, serverless kind of technologies. Software as a service is probably the best example of cloud native and everything in between. So modernization, we kind of mentioned that. I did make a joke yesterday. I'll repeat it just because it's so sad. And we all laugh at sad things, don't we? An organisation that I talked to in Europe, so it's cool, they're not in the room, who was a particular guy in the organisation was running Solaris on Spark with software that was as old as that was unsupported, and his boss said, move it to cloud, move it to cloud. And he said, as you should rightly say, come on, that's not a good example. Worked with him to look at some specialist vendors. Remember the first example of a cloud vendor on that list, and there can be great places for specialist vendors for that kind of corner case, because you can't modernize everything. Some things you're just so scared of, you don't want to touch it because it's probably going to break, and you approach it very reverently every couple of years, and because it's out of support, and do the tiniest update you can. But the conversion, the rewriting, the refactoring, the effort involved in that will be a lot of the focus over this period, right? Because the easy workloads, a lot of those have gone. And if you've chosen the right workloads, you've gotten value. But example, as I mentioned earlier, lift and shift is not cutting it. Right, we're starting to see a retreat there. So the trend that we have here is in terms of those modernization efforts. And you can see that modernization will increase as something that, in fact, actually, in terms of cloud strategy for migration, application modernization remains at the top of the priority list. Lift and shift, to the example, has dropped to the bottom. But that's, again, a function of choosing the right workloads. And the number one best practice now and through this whole period will be workload placement. How do you choose the right home for the right workload? And that's lovely to say cloud first, but there are things that just don't make sense if they're running on Solaris, or a lot of you trying to figure out what you do with your mid-range systems as well. Okay, here's one that I just think is bullshit. Did I say that? Did I swear? It's 90%. There's a friend of mine who's a journalist in the room, and I hope he doesn't quote me on that one. Come and talk to me afterwards. I want to hear your opinions on this, right? The appeal of Industry Cloud is huge, right? But the reality of it is mostly slideware. I hear some laughs there. And it depends a lot on how you get your Industry Cloud, right? You can get it from a hyperscaler whose business model has been horizontal, right? So why do they think suddenly they can be vertical? Because they've got PowerPoint, you know, and they can make a lovely slide. There at the other end of the spectrum is, and I see examples of this in Australia even, and particularly in government with some shared services, where you've got a community of like-minded organisations. Maybe they share a mission. I'll give you another example. It's not in Australia. In China, you look at retail banking there. You imagine how many branches that a bank have, and there are obviously a lot of regional provincial banks there. The bigger banks are providing the infrastructure, the cloud in that environment. I'd probably call that a community cloud. It's not a term that really caught on, but there's certainly an overlap there. And in the middle, I think, is the more realistic industry clouds, which is your kind of core application vendors, right? Because they know you're vertical ideally. There are some that are very horizontal, right, as well, but they're going to have a greater tendency to know your organisation, your industry, what's needed, what are the reference models you need, what are the integration points across that. And then again, also the SIs, system integrators. They tend to know your industry as well, and they can provide that value enhancement. But do scratch below the surface in terms of Industry Cloud. I'd love to hear your feedback on this. I'll tell you a couple of cautionary tales as we look at the trend here. It is going to grow. One of the things that's going to hold it back, though, is fear of picking the wrong horse. Right, and this is interesting too. It's not only enterprises that have this worry, it's some of the SaaS vendors as well. And the other trick is you've got these vertical experts that know your industry. They know how to do supply chain, or they know how to do clinical management. They're not going to just roll over and let the cloud vendors come and eat their lunch, right? So they're going to be multi-cloud. And you've got this challenge of which one do I pick? What's the Industry Cloud solution that's going to make sense for me? So again, it breaks that economy of scale, as does, the next one, digital sovereignty, digital geopolitics. It's not as much of an issue here as it is in other markets because we've kind of got a much more trusting relationship with the US. Huge issue in Europe, right? They don't like Americans. Problem is, right, this is the risk here, they haven't innovated, right? And you've got this political position, and you should see some of the Gartner analyst email threads. They end up being like 400, 500 emails long. I can't keep up with them. But they kind of boil down to the market domination versus, the role of the state to influence the market. And why is this important? Technology is becoming a strategic, it's part of the way that and I think the public sector for the most part, not exclusively, but understand this. Technology is becoming a core part of our ability to operate as a society, and are we willing to let that be in the hands of someone who we don't really have any legislative, regulatory mandates? A funny enough story, it's kind of related, talking to a client who was one of those poster child of being hacked. They found out who it was. It was the Chinese, I don't know if it was individuals or a group, collective effort or whatnot. FBI was able to find who it was. They couldn't prosecute, right, because there was no control. Probably more good examples would be things like India starting to develop its own CPUs, right? China, obviously, we know what's happening there. And one of the interesting things for me from the keynote yesterday was what happens with AI and ML, and AI and ML as a capability at a national level. I mean, if you think back 30 years, God, Japan had the decade of AI where they were investing in it. More recently, China, and I think Lee McMullen used this example yesterday as well, the #1 focus and the busiest analyst in Gartner is one of our China colleagues who focuses on AI and ML. In terms of academic development, he said, so I have to trust him on this, that on a factor of 20-1 academic papers around AI and ML are coming out of China. They clearly see it on the world stage, digital geopolitics. In the context of cloud, the ability to disrupt, to deglobalization, the impact would be that there's not the economies of scale, and you're not going to get the same level of innovation that results from that. And maybe you know that, maybe you've got organization, maybe you're running workloads in China, maybe you're running workloads in Europe. It becomes more of a factor over the next 5 years. All right, sustainability. I would have thought, my guess would have been if we didn't have such a focus on AI and ML this year, we would have talked about sustainability more so. And Gartner views sustainability, as I expect most of you do or will do. It's the E, the S, and the G. The environmental is what we're going to focus on here for a moment. But the social and the governance have to go hand in hand with that. I've never yet seen it as the deciding factor in a cloud choice, but I am starting to finally see it as something that is considered as part of it. I've been part of a team that's now done a sustainability assessment of Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, and now we're going to the next range of vendors. The next one I'm doing it right now, is Alibaba. The thing is, it's an interesting thing to do, right? We can't assess, we can't go and measure the tailpipes of all the Amazon delivery vehicles, but we can assess the level of disclosure and the areas which they disclose and the areas that which they don't. And you can't compare an Amazon, say, to a Google in terms of their environmental metrics, because, you know, it's like chalk and cheese and day and night, right? Amazon's got all those delivery trucks, whereas Google is more of a kind of centralized. They both have a huge environmental impact in terms of their data centers, and it is something you're all going to be looking at. I'm sure you are. The bigger picture around DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, we even see that Gartner as a vendor in terms of what you're asking us to demonstrate. Big topic, very passionate about the topic, but we've only got about a minute left. So, you know, top 5 factor for sure. Table stakes for all the cloud vendors, absolutely. And some innovation there as well as a more sustainable compute resource if you've got batch workloads. Compulsory slide on AI and ML, maybe the thing that, and look, this is back to the train analogy as we start to wrap up. You know, AI and ML would not have progressed in the way it has without cloud, right? So maybe it's an example of that industry that started out of the expansion of the railroad, whatever analogy you want to have. Maybe it's been said, maybe it hasn't. I think I'm going to be focusing on multi-AI. Funny enough, Google, who had a couple of missteps this year in this area, they now talk about a garden of models. Look at that, I'm on 0, so hopefully the streaming people aren't too upset with me. What's the implications? You're going to have your own cloud journey, right? This is where the best practice around cloud operating model comes into play. Just got to laugh at this lectern here like I did yesterday. Not very solid. It should be business driven. It will be cloud as more of an enabler moving forward. All of your software is going to be, most of your software is going to be taken in that direction. A qualification on this slide, this is in the context of cloud and your cloud teams. They will be increasingly infused in the business. And in fact, one of those catchy things to say, there is no cloud computing anymore, there's just computing. And I think that's definitely the case. You're going to see more. One of the other trends we really didn't talk about was how cloud is coming on-prem, what we call distributed cloud. We've got a magic quadrant coming up in that. Security, just for the record, we came on the record quite a few years ago and saying cloud is as secure or more secure than you are. It's really a matter of how you use it. Right? I think we've done some missteps, S3 buckets and all that sort of stuff needs to be secure by default. What are the inhibitors here and what are the accelerators? What's going to make this go faster and what's going to make it go slower? Some black swans, maybe. You know, COVID was an absolute left field that demonstrated the scalability value of cloud. The focus on digital is a big factor. I talked about deglobalization, digital sovereignty, digital geopolitics. I mean, it might sound fluffy and whatnot, but it is a strategic area that I would recommend you look at. It will change potentially who you play with and how new innovations become available to you and at what speed they can do that because of the economies of scale. But as it says in the bottom, skills will remain your biggest problem. I talk to people every day around this challenge. Look at your cloud operating model as a best practice. Now, in terms of recommendations, it's architecture driven, right? It needs to be driven by the innovation. You should assume through this period where you put it is where it's going to stay for the most part. We need to have that product mindset, the delivery of solutions based off a common platform. Platform engineering, something you hear about. Data and analytics, top two, and has been for many, many years, along with security. Infrastructure and ops has got to change, right? Those classic ways of waterfall and ITIL and ITSM, they're giving way to DevOps and DevSecOps. New forms of agility. That's not to say the old ones don't go away, but they do change. Security, DevSecOps, I just mentioned that, security and risk. And finally, sourcing and procurement. This is a big one. Cloud ops, FinOps is critical. I bet you someone will come up and tell me their war stories around expense management. We're still on a journey there. Sourcing, procurement, bill shock, big issues. Lots of Gartner research. Apologies for going a few minutes over. I'm between you and lunch. I'd like to thank you for your attendance today. Enjoy the rest of the conference.